Morgan experienced a horrifying realization about who she had spent most of her life with when her husband Rodney first raised his hand against her. It was a turning point in their relationship. She had always known him as a kind and sensitive man who even refused to watch movies depicting violence against women. Rodney positioned himself as a fighter for women's rights. So when he hit her during an argument at the lake, it came as a real shock to Morgan. It happened during one of their shared weekends when the couple was boating together. They had a fight on the water, and when they returned to the cabin, the man attacked his wife with his fists. Several strong blows rained down on Morgan, who did not expect such fury from her beloved. Rodney had always been against physical violence, so his outburst of aggression was completely unexpected. Immediately after the incident, the shocked woman called her father and begged him to take her away from the lake house. When the man arrived, Rodney vehemently denied hitting his wife. However, his father-in-law saw with his own eyes the traces of beatings on his daughter's face. The former fighter for women's rights instantly turned into a brutal abuser. But Rodney didn't stop there. He began to demonstrate his manipulative nature. Somehow, he managed to convince all of Morgan's friends that she had given herself the bruises to smear him. The man claimed that during the heat of the argument, his wife began to hit herself, leaving marks on her face. And he only tried to restrain her from this madness and could accidentally leave a few bruises. Rodney went even further in his manipulations. He talked to Morgan for hours until he convinced her that she was partly to blame for the incident. The woman really began to doubt herself and feel guilty. From that moment on, the man constantly used this tactic. He worked on his wife until she believed that the quarrels and problems in their family were happening because of her. Rodney even blamed Morgan for his professional troubles. He claimed that because of her, he began to have problems at work. In reality, he lost his job himself, and his wife was forced to take on 2 jobs to provide for the family. But despite the financial difficulties, the man did not appreciate her efforts and only got irritated and lashed out at his loved ones. During this period, the violence against Morgan intensified. In addition to psychological pressure, she also suffered from her husband's sexual harassment. It became unbearable to endure this. Therefore, in 2020, the woman decided to put an end to the abuse and filed for divorce. In December of the same year, the marriage was officially dissolved. The realization came to Morgan with a terrifying understanding of who she had shared a significant part of her life with. Without wasting any time, she called her father, begging him to take her away from the cottage by the lake. When he arrived at the scene, Morgan's husband denied the fact of physical abuse. He then demonstrated the full depth of his manipulative nature. Somehow, he managed to convince his wife's friends that she had given herself the bruises to smear him. According to the man, during the argument, Morgan hit herself in the face, leaving marks. Allegedly, he could have accidentally left a few bruises while only trying to restrain her from this crazy behavior, exclusively for her own good. But the manipulator did not stop there. After lengthy conversations with his wife, he was able to convince even her that she was partly to blame for that incident. Since then, such tactics became usual for him. He worked on Morgan, gradually inclining her to think that she was the cause of the problems and quarrels in their family. The man even blamed his wife for his own career troubles. Meanwhile, the abuse of Morgan only intensified. In addition to psychological pressure, she suffered from sexual violence. But this could not go on forever. In 2020, the woman decided to put an end to it and filed for divorce. This decision immediately brought relief, and in December 2020, the marriage was officially dissolved. Morgan wanted to move on, but she could not completely break away from her ex-husband. They had children together. The couple did not divide custody through the court but agreed on everything verbally. They remained on good terms to traumatize the children less. The former spouses maintained close contact and even traveled together to Morgan's sister in Florida on the eve of Christmas. Both insisted that although their marriage had ended, they got along great for the sake of the children. But suddenly, at the end of the year, Morgan was attacked. Early in the morning on January 1, 2021, Morgan's ex-husband drove up to her house. After knocking on the door and not getting an answer, he walked around, thinking she was still asleep and loudly calling her name. Suddenly, the man noticed Morgan on the back porch. She was lying half-naked on the terrace with her hands tied behind her back. A pillowcase was over her head. She had obviously suffered greatly. Approaching, he administered first aid to Morgan and tried to find out what had happened. Then he called 911 for emergency services. Arriving at the scene, the police found that the woman had been subjected to brutal treatment, rape and beating. She was extremely frightened and could barely talk about what she had experienced. According to Morgan, that night a stranger in a black mask broke into her house. He attacked her and beat her violently. He choked her several times until she lost consciousness and then raped her. The attacker threatened to kill her and even her ex-husband, who was no longer living with Morgan at that time. In the presence of relatives who were already on the scene, the police began to unravel what had happened and recorded the testimony of the young woman. Morgan had planned to celebrate this New Year's Eve with her best friend and business colleague Nicole. After drinking a glass of champagne, the woman felt very tired from the upheavals she had just experienced. So she decided to go home to go to bed early. The friends argued a little about this, but the heroine of the story insisted that she needed rest and recuperation. At that time, Morgan's 8-year-old children were staying with her parents. So for her, this was a good opportunity to get a good night's sleep for the first time in several weeks. The woman returned to her house, turned on the alarm, and went to rest. She woke up in the middle of the night in her bedroom with the feeling of someone else's presence. In the doorway, Morgan noticed a dark silhouette. At first, it seemed to her that it was only a ghost. But upon closer inspection, she realized that it was not a dream. The man was dressed in black and wore a mask resembling a Batman mask. The tall figure looked very sinister. The stranger stood with clenched fists, as if about to attack. A gun appeared in his hand. He pounced on the defenseless woman, hitting her with the weapon and then several times with his fist in the face. Turning Morgan onto her stomach, he pulled her hands behind her back, using plastic ties for bonds. Despite the woman's pleas to let her go, the intruder did not listen. Instead, he uttered a few phrases about how she would regret what she had done. However, he did not give any details about the motive. Morgan felt that the stranger was deliberately changing his voice, imitating Batman in accordance with his outfit. The most terrifying for the victim were the beatings and strangulation. Several times she lost consciousness, and when she came to her senses, everything was repeated again. The woman was sure that she would not survive this night. The criminal was torturing her. One of Morgan's most frightening memories was the moments when the attacker brought her to the brink of life and death, barely allowing her to breathe. The woman described that in those moments, she seemed to be experiencing an out-of-body experience, observing the torture of her body as if from the side. Her thoughts were with her children and husband. She regretted not having time to make a will. Meanwhile, the beating and rape continued. The criminal did not spare the baton in his fists. Morgan could not imagine who could have wished to do something so cruel to her. But deep down, she had a hunch. The dark clothing and altered voice were meant to hide the identity of the attacker, which was probably familiar to her. The experienced detectives shared this hypothesis. But Morgan was especially alarmed by the threats against her ex-husband, from whom she had recently divorced. During one of the strangulations, the attacker hissed through his teeth that she would have to mourn for Rodney. A shocking guess flashed through Morgan's mind: what if it was Rodney himself? Deciding to play the usual psychological game with him, she began to beg not to harm her husband, saying that she loved him very much. And then an amazing twist happened: the beating stopped. The attacker left the woman on the bed and began rummaging through the room in search of valuables. Morgan realized that she had managed to save her life. The criminal no longer acted like a murderer. Now he was only interested in money and jewelry. But before escaping, he took the woman's mobile phone and password, probably to erase the video from the surveillance cameras. Finally, the attacker dragged Morgan into the backyard, throwing a pillowcase over her head. He ordered her to lie still until she heard 2 car signals, threatening to return and shoot her if she disobeyed. The frightened woman lay there for over half an hour, afraid to move. She didn't hear any signals but suspected that the criminal might be lurking nearby. The terrible waiting continued. In a remote area of the city, no one would have heard her screams. But suddenly, Morgan heard footsteps and noise. Was the attacker changing his mind and coming back to kill her? The footsteps stopped nearby, and the woman heard Rodney's familiar voice. Her ex-husband discovered Morgan bound in plastic ties and with a bag over her head around 2 in the morning. They had not arranged to meet, and the children were with their grandparents. Rodney's appearance at that very moment seemed highly suspicious to Morgan. Nevertheless, the woman held on. She feigned hysteria and began to beg Rodney to stay with her and call for help. In fact, Morgan wanted to keep the suspect until the police arrived. When the 911 call went out and the patrol officers headed to the victim's home, Rodney was already waiting in his car near the house. This seemed strange to the cops. Why didn't the man stay with his beaten wife until help arrived? To the interrogation, Rodney responded with a romantic story. He said he was celebrating New Year's Eve alone and was missing Morgan when he suddenly saw a strange young man writing her name on the foggy window. This alarmed him so much that after several unsuccessful attempts to reach her, he felt something was wrong and rushed to his ex-wife, fortunately living only a 15-minute drive away. The investigators began to examine the crime scene. Morgan was brutally beaten, her eye was swollen and barely opened. The nature of the injuries indicated the attacker's emotionality, his personal resentment or anger towards the victim, and not just an ordinary robbery or intrusion by a random criminal. Morgan's father and brother arrived at the scene. The police decided to question all those present separately. As soon as the woman was alone with the officer, away from relatives and Rodney, she made a shocking confession. According to Morgan, it was her ex-husband who attacked her, and now he was pretending to be a savior to deflect suspicion. The woman described the course of events in detail, especially emphasizing the moment when she declared her love for Rodney and the beating abruptly stopped. She recognized his touch when he carried her to the porch. Morgan confessed that she had purposely begged Rodney to stay with her, afraid to directly accuse him of the crime, so that he would not kill her, hiding the traces. Psychologically, it seemed plausible, because the most dangerous period for a woman who had been in a toxic relationship for a long time was immediately after the breakup. As it turned out, the entire first week after the divorce, Rodney obsessively pursued Morgan, trying to manipulate her with pity. The situation took a sinister turn on New Year's Eve. Rodney showed Morgan a doctor's note, as if he had been diagnosed with cancer. Given the recent death of his brother from leukemia and his father's battle with cancer, this aroused considerable sympathy in the woman. However, the pity did not grow into anything more. Rodney tried to get closer to Morgan on an emotional level, using his feelings as leverage. The woman even let him live in her house. But after just a few days, Rodney began to insistently persuade her to resume the relationship, pressing on pity and resorting to manipulation. By December 31st, Morgan finally saw the light and decided to completely cut ties with him and stop supporting him. Rodney was forced to return to his apartment. But less than a day passed when the woman was subjected to a terrible attack. The day before, the man once again tried to convince her to give their relationship a second chance, even claiming to have found a new high-paying job for his wife's sake. At the end of the year, he slipped a check for $56,000 under the door. Interestingly, it was this very check that was later stolen by the intruder who attacked Morgan. Too many coincidences to consider it an accident. Recounting all these facts to the police, the woman was most concerned that the detectives might believe the words of her manipulative ex-husband and not her. This had happened before, even with close people. So when one of the investigators remarked that her story sounded convincing and Rodney should be thoroughly checked, it was a great relief for Morgan. The detectives set about exposing the suspect's lies by verifying each of his statements. They started with the claim about repeated attempts to call his wife before arrival. Morgan denied receiving any calls. And when examining Rodney's mobile phone, no outgoing calls were found. Instead, numerous photos of the ex-wife's naked body were found on the phone, taken secretly without her knowledge. Judging by the dates, Rodney had systematically photographed Morgan for a whole week while living with her after reporting his illness. There were also numerous screenshots of her phone with personal correspondence with other men. These photographs clearly indicated stalking and confirmed the victim's words. Morgan assured that she had no idea about the existence of such photos and never gave permission to be photographed. The mere presence of these facts was enough to bring charges of a serious violation of privacy. Rodney was detained as the main suspect in the attack. He feigned shock and outrage. A check of Morgan's phone revealed that the criminal had deleted all recordings from the house's surveillance cameras. This also indirectly pointed to Rodney's guilt. A random robber would hardly have known about the victim's security system and how to use it. And under other circumstances, he would rather have chosen a less protected target. It was also strange how the intruder managed to sneak inside unnoticed without triggering the alarm. There were sensors on the doors and windows, but none detected a break-in. All systems were working properly, except for a single sensor on a window leading to the basement. It was through this window that the attacker got in. Probably, Rodney deliberately shifted the sensor when he stayed with Morgan after the divorce, planning the attack. The very next day after the arrest, the cops conducted a search of the suspect's house with a warrant. They found even more indirect evidence of involvement. Rodney's browser history revealed many alarming queries: how long does it take to strangle a person to unconsciousness without a lethal result, how to change one's voice. The man even read a book on psychological techniques for influencing women called 7 Ways to Become a Hero to Your Wife. The medical certificate that Rodney showed Morgan as confirmation of the cancer diagnosis turned out to be fake. He created an email account in the name of a non-existent doctor to send himself a forged medical report. During the interrogations, Rodney found excuses for every exposed detail. After the first interrogation, the investigators concluded that there was not enough evidence against the main suspect. He was released, but the investigation continued. The biggest problem for Rodney was the plastic ties found in his apartment. He had specially modified them, cutting them in a certain way to get improvised handcuffs that could be quickly put on and fixed. A whole pack of such items was found. Some of the sets were modified exactly like those that were removed from Morgan's hands. The coincidence seemed too obvious. When asked about the ties, Rodney claimed that he didn't have them at all and had never bought them. He said that someone could have planted them to frame him. The suspect's words needed verification. The detectives began to visit local hardware stores. The same day, they found a video recording of Rodney buying the mentioned ties. The man was confused and could not explain it. But the most terrifying find was a note in Rodney's apartment. It was a farewell letter in which he wrote about his intention to kill Morgan and then himself, leaving the children orphaned. The woman miraculously managed to save herself by using psychological manipulation, which stopped the criminal and made him change his mind. Perhaps Rodney decided that not all was lost and he would be able to reconcile with his ex-wife. It was this illusory hope of reuniting that actually saved Morgan's life. Among the most valuable evidence was a video from the facade of Rodney's apartment building. It did not show anyone approaching the window and writing Morgan's name on the glass. But the suspect himself returned home shortly after the attack. He spent about 4 minutes in the apartment, probably changing clothes and getting rid of physical evidence. Leaving the building before returning to the victim's home, Rodney was holding a black bag. Later, he threw it away. Unfortunately, the investigation failed to find this potentially important piece of evidence. A day later, Rodney was arrested for the second time. This time, a whole range of other charges was added to the violation of privacy charges: unlawful entry, property damage, possession of a firearm, robbery, assault with aggravating circumstances involving torture and strangulation, burglary, kidnapping, and rape. The suspect was held in custody without the right to bail. And the day after the charges were brought, Morgan came to the police station with her friend Nicole. The woman was no longer sure that it was Rodney who had attacked her. The reason for the doubts was new manipulation on his part. While behind bars, the man contacted Morgan and tried to convince her that he had become a victim of slander. Allegedly, his ex-wife was accusing him of terrible crimes that he was supposedly incapable of committing. This demonstrated the degree of destructive influence that Rodney exerted on Morgan even after everything that had happened. The woman suffered serious physical and psychological trauma as a result of the attack. She had to wait for all the wounds to heal before picking up the children from her parents. Ahead, Morgan faced a difficult conversation with the twins, during which she had to explain why their dad would no longer be around. For long months, the woman was tormented by nightmares about the violence she had experienced. Sometimes she could not find the strength to even take the children to school, afraid of being left alone in the house. The prosecutors had enough evidence against Rodney to secure a severe punishment. But to spare Morgan additional suffering during the trial, a plea bargain was proposed. 8 months later, on August 4, 2021, Rodney Metzger pleaded guilty to 14 counts related to the attack on his ex-wife. He was sentenced to 70 years in prison with the right to parole after 25 years. The rest of the term would be served on probation. In fact, this meant that Rodney would be under police supervision for the rest of his life. Interestingly, the man himself forbade visits to the prison even for his own mother. He does not want her to see her son behind bars. The woman is very worried because after the start of the imprisonment, Rodney's health rapidly deteriorated, particularly due to diagnosed diabetes. However, it is expected that he will be released in 2046. Morgan underwent therapy and largely recovered from the horror she experienced. She obtained a ban for her ex-husband to meet with the children. But this measure turned out to be unnecessary. The twins themselves show no interest in communicating with their father. They can hardly remember what he looks like. Please write your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. For those who are new here, subscribing is the best way to stay updated on future content. Also give a like please. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you for your support during this difficult time. Until next time, friends.